You're listening to the Art of Procurement.
Hi there, everybody. You are indeed listening to The Art of Procurement. It's the podcast where we aim to increase your career fulfillment while collectively elevating the role of the profession that we all love, obviously being procurement. My name's Philip Heitzen. I'm the host of the show, and that voice that you heard at the very beginning, before the music kicked in, was my 5-year-old son, Tristan. So here in the US, last Thursday, it was actually Bring Your Child to Work Day. And so as part of a number of fun activities that we had planned during the day, we thought it'd be fun to record an introduction into today's podcast. I do have to say that I did find him sleeping on the job later in the day, so his day working in procurement clearly wiped him out. This being the last episode of the month, you might actually be expecting our This Month in Procurement podcast with Kelly. Unfortunately, and I'm sure it's as a result of me being on the road at various procurement conferences for the past 4 weeks, I actually came down with a bit of a sickness. And so as anyone who watched into our AOP live session last week, no doubt will have noticed, I've been coughing and spluttering, and this is probably like the third take I've done of this intro as well as a result of that same coughing. So we didn't get the chance to record the show as we normally would have done. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the recording of an AOP live webinar that we did at the very beginning of the month. And in this one, I sat down with Kris Koneru. Kris is the business practice head of sourcing and procurement at Infosys BPO. And as you may know, but I just wanted to really call this out, Infosys sponsored the webinar, but the questions are derived from the audience, both during the webinar and then collected in advance as well. We really want to make these AOP live webinars like a podcast, but where you get the chance to interact rather than just being me answering me asking all the questions. So the theme of the discussion is actually a topic that I'm seeing more and more execs discuss. You know, certainly the events that I've been to for the past month to 6 weeks. And that is, while digital transformation is all the rage, and I think it's going to continue to be for a long time yet, we're starting to talk about what are some of the things that we need to do from a people and a process perspective to ensure that we're going to maximize the impact of these new technologies rather than just spending the money to implement a new system, a new platform, whatever it may be, and expecting that it's really going to work out of the box. Now, before we start, I do just want to say that if you'd like to be notified whenever we schedule an AOP live webinar like the one I'm about to play the audio from, just go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe. We're targeting a minimum of one webinar a month for the rest of the year. Okay, so let's go into this AOP live session, or the recording of this AOP live session with Kris. And in my first question, I asked Kris if he found procurement or if procurement found him.
Like I think a lot of people in procurement, especially the ones who've been in procurement for 25, 30 years, like me, they would mostly procurement would have found them rather than they finding procurement, because at that time procurement was not really a mainstream career path. In a lot of organizations, it was probably not even known as procurement.
Right.
And sourcing was something that we didn't even use those terminologies at that time. It was mostly called purchasing, at that time. So yes, and very quickly, actually, I was being a chemical engineer by training. Okay. I was actually, posted to and as a trainee, I was posted to the design department of the organization. And as luck would have it, the purchasing manager at that time, and it was not a very large company, he broke his arm and there was in an accident. And I was deputed to help him because there was a lot of procurement work from projects and so on. And I probably did a good job of it. And then the company asked me to continue. Right. One of the advantages or disadvantages of doing a good job is then you get stuck with it. And so it's 30 years since then that I'm in procurement.
I think it's the first time I've heard of anybody being in procurement because of a broken bone. So it's obviously it was meant to be. I want to go into the conversation that we're having about technology first with the first question. And I wondered if you could just share what's the most common misconception that you hear in discussions about digital transformation and what technology can achieve.
Yeah, so I think one of the, I would say, questions and as well as what people have in their mind is because digital transformation is a terminology which has come in into vogue only in the last 1 to 1.5 years or max 2 years. And of course, it's also become a fashion to prefix digital in front of everything nowadays. So, and in the conversations with procurement leaders across organizations, one of the things that they would like to know is what exactly does digital transformation or digital procurement mean? Does it mean that they have to bring in scrap whatever they have in terms of technology and bring in something new? What is being called as artificial intelligence and machine learning and things like that? Or is it about a lot of robots that people are talking about? Yeah. Or what is it? So these are questions which have not been answered, I would say, very clearly, and everybody talks about it, but nobody is defining it clearly. And the other thing about it is in terms of transformation. So what does transformation mean? And it could mean different things for different people, depending upon where they are in their procurement maturity today. So I think these are the questions which we need to answer, and what I get those questions as well as in terms of as to what does this mean.
Mm-hmm. Do you think is there such a thing as transformation, or should we be thinking about the journey as more of a journey that's an evolution?
Yes, in a way, you are right that for every organization, including procurement as a function in an organization, it's always about evolving into the next level to meet the organization's requirements and the demands of the organization and so on. So I believe that it's an ongoing journey. However, at different points in time, some people would like to call it transformation, probably because there is a step change which is required more so in today's environment. So I think why it is more relevant to call it transformation is one is change has become much more rapid and dynamic, and procurement needs to be in step with that. And from where procurement is, or in the last few years, where procurement has found itself, to what the rapidly changing needs of the organization is, I think there is a fairly significant step change, and hence the word transformation is probably more apt, while the evolution would be a continuous one.
So the areas I want to cover today, broad categories. I want to talk a little bit what we're doing now about enabling change through technology. Then I want to talk a little bit about the impact of technology on our relationships, particularly our stakeholder relationships, the impact on our objectives and metrics, and then go into implications from a leadership perspective. Now, one of the things you talked about was like, what really is digitization? And I actually had a question from Alex who asked, how does robotic process automation, so RPA, how does that differ from traditional business process automation? So are they the same thing, just with a person versus a bot, or how should we be thinking about RPA?
I think these are terminologies which have been used interchangeably in some contexts. So automation or robotic process automation, or just process automation, as the case may be. I think when we say automation, it means, well, if it was being done manually and now it is done electronically or digitally, using a tool, a technology tool, then that is very simply what is called automation. Probably robotic process automation would be where a series of steps or a part of the process or the entire process is being automated in a sequential way rather than in parts. And that sequence is happening just like a human would do it.
Yeah.
And it could mean that data is being fetched from different parts of the systems or different systems. It is being checked and validated. So it's not just only the process which is being completed, but there is more of say basic validation, a little bit of computation as well, some calculations and things like that. And then it is completing the process just like a human would do. So
Right.
I would say from the basic process automation, where say for example, PR is being converted to a PO or a PO is being automatically sent to a vendor, which would be the process automation which we may have been talking about earlier. Now the robotics automation is able to check whether the PR is complete. If it is not complete, it is able to complete it and then convert it into a PO, even send it for approvals and follow it up, just like a human would do.
Yeah.
So whether we call it as advanced process automation or robotics process automation, as the industry would like to call it, it's probably the next stage of process automation, I would say.
Now, we got a number of questions on this broad topic about the use of process automation within the procurement space. You talked a little bit there about the use from the P2P side of the procurement continuum, if you will. How about the source to contract? Do you see RPA being used on the source to contract side?
In a limited way, I would say yes. Some parts of it, for example, sending out RFXs to vendors, finding out which contracts are coming up for renewal, and sending out an automated alert to the relevant stakeholders that these are the contracts which are coming up for renewal or going to expire. So, from a process automation point of view, I would say there is less widespread use in the source to contract space compared to the procure to pay space, which is more transactional in nature.
Now, do you feel that a lot of people that you talk about when they're talking about transformation, they're talking about the digital element of transformation. They're looking at the technology as being like the silver bullet that's going to change the game for them. As opposed to it being an enabler. I wonder what you hear and perhaps, the guidance that you give to them if you do hear that.
Yeah, so I think you're right that technology more often than not is seen as a silver bullet which is going to solve all the problems. However, I think what is more important is to have a view of what the transformation of the procurement function of your procurement function is going to be, right? So, for example, a lot of the organizations are, instead of the traditional focus on savings, they are now moving to value from third-party suppliers, right? So rather than just focus on savings.
Yeah.
And I've also been asked this question: what does that mean? What does value mean, and versus savings? So it could be very simple examples, which procurement is aware of. It's just that we have to see it in a different light. So, for example, for a large mining company, we found that instead of, so the mandate to the procurement team was, these are steel balls which are used for grinding media, and you negotiate a better price for that. Instead of that, the procurement team went out, did some supply market research. They found out that there are alternative materials which are light carbon fiber kind of materials, which do the same job and probably more effectively. They last longer, and also lead to less power consumption of the machines themselves. So something like, say, total cost of ownership, which has been around for quite a long while in procurement itself. So it need not necessarily be, so procurement could have focused only on the unit cost savings and badgering the supplier to get lower prices, or they could look at what is happening in the supply market. Are there alternatives available? And of course, it's always it's not as easy as I make it sound to be. There is, change management involved. There is trials, and it needs to prove itself, and so on. But then that's the path which procurement needs to follow to drive more value rather than savings. So I think the focus should change from, and is changing from, just pure play savings to driving more value and more business metrics for the organization.
Okay. Now I have a follow-up, but Kelly, I think you have a question you wanted to jump in with.
Yes, thank you, Phil. So, Kris, this question comes from Hannah, and she's pointing out the fact that, we're only 15 minutes in here, and we've already discussed a number of big topics where an organization's definition or interpretation of some of these terms or ideas are critical to not only being able to apply the right technologies, but also being able to decide if an effort is a success. So things like you've mentioned, there's multiple different kinds of automation. We've talked about the idea of transformation. We've talked about the idea of value. At the outset of any of these big picture change initiatives, what kinds of conversations or strategies or visions does a company need to discuss to make sure that everyone is on the same page, and that these big important terms that keep getting thrown around mean the same thing to all of the people involved in the project?
No, I think absolutely right. And this should be driven by the procurement leadership of the organization, right from the chief procurement officer or the head of procurement for that company. And procurement leadership should formulate, of course, with some consultation from the team as well, should formulate as to what is the transformed state that the organization should be looking at, the procurement organization should be looking at. So whether it is, as I said, focus from savings to value, focus on risk and sustainability versus just looking at fulfilling supplies, or looking at stakeholder experience versus just enforcing control and process, which typically procurement has done. So across some of these key, I would say, expectations and drivers for procurement, the procurement leadership team of the organization should define and lay down a transformation path, saying this is where we would like to be, which then needs to be communicated to the rest of the organization, both the stakeholders and as well as the procurement organization, saying this is where we would like to be.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. I got a question that came in as well from Jaya Thurithar, I think it is. I'd like to know, how will procurement change strategically? So I'm kind of paraphrasing. How could procurement change strategically in the next 5 to 10 years once the potential of automation techniques are realized?
Yeah, so one is, of course, I mentioned that some of those key drivers, while I think Jayatitha was typing his question, I think we addressed some of those key drivers in terms of becoming more proactive and predictive, focus on value, and being focused more on risk and sustainability rather than, and making it more user-friendly and things like that. So that's how we see procurement will transform itself and needs to transform itself to manage the innovation requirements of the organization, or to enable the organization to face disruptions, both from political and environmental reasons, and as well as to manage stakeholder expectations. So there are shareholders, there are employees, millennials, so different kinds of expectations which procurement needs to manage. So to manage all these, and procurement would need to change along these lines that we just discussed. And today, the reason why we are calling it digital transformation is, with the advanced technologies that are available now and which continue to emerge and newer applications continue to emerge. All these make the job of transforming the procurement function much more easier, and there is much more application of technology which procurement can do to move to this transformed state that we were talking about. As an example, so for example, procurement has long struggled, despite spend analytics tools being available for a large number of years now. We find that procurement organizations still struggle to have accurate, up-to-date spend data, which is clean and classified rightly, and so on. And you don't have a huge amount of miscellaneous and unclassified materials and services. And where you are able to get the spend visibility quickly and not after 2 or 3 months.
Right.
It is mostly reactive or historic.
Actionable, right? You want it to be actionable at the time that it's proactive.
Yeah. But now with the advancements in the technology side, using AI for some of these applications, especially for spend analytics, I know of a recent case where a large pharma company, they spent about 2 to 3 years trying to cleanse, classify their spend data, and they were still at it with only about 40-50% of accuracy.
Yeah.
But now with the tools that are available, in about 4 to 5 months, the classification and the availability and the recency and the accuracy of data moved up to 95% plus, with near real-time visibility into spend. So look at the dramatic change. You have been struggling for 2 to 3 years. Now in a period of 3 to 6 months, you can have all this and then maintain it using technology. So unlike that, today there are advancements in similarly in category management, right? So category management again is a very still a very traditional area of procurement. There is very little of I would say technology intervention which has happened in category management, and but now with the advent of these new technologies, that is also up for a evolutionary and a transformational change.
Yeah, I see. It's funny. I was at SAP Ariba live yesterday on a panel talking about technology, and that's one of the points that I was making is around spend. We're talking about all these wonderful new things that we could do, but for most organizations, we still really struggle to even know what we're spending when we're spending it. So let's focus on the basics. If you're more mature, then you can start to look at some of the other things that you can do. But the fundamentals of we need good data, and that requires good data in as well as good data out. But understanding our data and market insights are still the two most important things from a strategic procurement perspective, at least in what technology can do for us. What I did want to do is a follow-up question. So we talked a lot about the different types of technology that we can use and how procurement can evolve, but how do we kind of design that into the process? Do we bring technology in and design process around it, or do you set your process and just try and drop technology into it? What's kind of the best approach to get the most out of that technology investment?
Yeah, so my experience has been that, and we have been one of the pioneers in applying design thinking to business processes and how to design business processes with a design thinking approach. So the design thinking approach, basically what it means is looking at it from a user perspective. And even in procurement space, we have been hearing about it, and organizations are moving towards it, and some organizations are still trying to move towards that, where we have said that we all have I'm not trying to promote Amazon, but that's the usual reference which is given.
The de facto.
So the usual reference that is given is we have the Amazon experience in our personal lives. Why can't we have that when we go to office, right? And there, if you want to buy something, it's completely the opposite. So, there are lots of advancements which have happened in that space as well. Today we have, procurement assistants and chatbot-based guided buying, which is actually an advancement over the Amazon kind of interface as well. So I would say it should be basically think more first about the user. What is the user's perspective? What is the user's experience journey when they want to buy something, or when they want to look at a particular contract, when they want to review a relationship with a supplier? What is their need? How do they go about fulfilling their need? And then putting the relevant technology elements to make that happen for the user. Right. So I think that should be the approach.
So that brings an interesting point. I'm going to go back to a question that Ramesh asked, because I think it's relevant to what you said there. And the question is, do the implications of digitization differ by spend category? So, for example, when you think of it could be just using the design thinking in terms of a customized journey based on the different category, or it could be different technologies from an automation perspective. Does it differ when you're looking at something like MRO versus something like professional services?
Yes, so it does differ primarily because of the evolution of the supply markets and the suppliers in that particular category, right? So, for example, in the freight and logistics category today, you have companies which claim to be the Expedia of freight.
Yeah.
There is Uber Freight as well in some markets around the world, and so on. So in some of those, similarly, like in professional services, you have, again, I'm just quoting these company names. We don't have a tie-up with them, or neither am I promoting, but just as examples. So like in professional services, we have Globality and similar organizations which are changing or making the supply market or disrupting the supply market in some manner in some of those categories. MRO again is a fairly evolved category where there are a lot of, at least in the US and Europe and some other markets, there are very highly evolved players with a lot of technology that they bring in to make MRO procurement very seamless and and to transform MRO procurement.
Yeah.
So I think while in some of the other areas there is still, I would say less development in the supplier markets in those categories. So yes, to an extent, it does depend in terms of what innovation the supply market is seeing in those categories. Otherwise, from a source to pay perspective, or from the procurement manager's perspective, the tools that are available can be applied to most of these categories that people procure.
So when you're looking at somebody's purchasing journey, what's kind of your approach, or perhaps some tips that you have because when we write process, we usually write process that is, you do this, you do that, then you do the other. It's a 7-step process. You have to check all these boxes. If you don't check all these boxes, then you've not done the process like it should be. How are you encouraging others to build like the guides or the framework, if you will, but without necessarily saying, hey, you got to follow every one of these 7 steps, because actually their buying journey may look a little bit different?
Yeah, I think it follows from, I think there's an echo somewhere. So, okay. Yeah. So I think it follows from, firstly, we have to analyze, it can't be a one size fits all. And I think that's a mistake a lot of times when we try to force fit a process into a tool, any source to pay tool. Typically that's what happens. You end up having a 7-step or a 10-step, or maybe in some cases a 20-step process for everything. And that's what frustrates the users, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think it needs to follow from the analysis of data and the buying patterns, and as well as a mapping in terms of what is critical, what is low value, what is leverage routine. So the typical analysis, which a lot of times gets done probably only once in a few years, and then everybody just follows something. So when you are setting up a new tool, for example, if you are implementing Ariba or Coupa or any of the Jagger or any of the source to pay tools, you'll probably do a one-time blueprinting exercise, and then for the next 10 years, then everybody just is expected to follow that. And so I think what we advise clients and organizations is that I think this is a dynamic situation. The buying patterns change. What is strategic, leverage, routine, bottleneck for an organization, it keeps changing. And the buying channels, right, and how difficult or easy it is for the users should be reviewed on at least on an annual basis. And you make it for some of the things today, organizations are allowing people to buy from they have linked up with Amazon Business or with other marketplaces, and you can buy those, or it could be that you have your internal catalogs where you do that. So I think the whole guided buying process, which we are saying is now moving towards more of a chatbot based guided buying interface. I think that should basically guide people saying, okay, you want to buy this, then the engine should know what the user is buying, and how easy or difficult it should be based on the value or the type of item and so on. And that's where the new technologies can help to do this even as the user is typing his or her requirement, right?
No, I'm actually encouraged to hear you talk about guided buying, because ironically that panel discussion I was telling you about that I was on yesterday, I talked about if you haven't got a certain level of technological maturity, that sorting out your spend analysis is the place to focus. If you've done that, guided buying is the place to go next, in my mind, because that allows you the business to self-source so much of what they actually come through procurement for, but within, you've at least got constraints built into the guided buying kind of process and flow, so that you're really only focusing on the 20% that's the most important. And guided buying can actually let somebody can go in and have this consumer interface like an Amazon, type in what they want, and it could be like a notebook, and it's going to take you to a catalog, you do the transaction, never touch procurement. It could be some marketing services, and then that can push you into a triage, which then connects you with the category lead for that category. So you suddenly have one single place where everybody can go to start their buying journey, and the technology will basically tell you where to go.
Yeah. So I think going back to your previous topic that we were discussing, procurement's role is to what will be procurement's role when as we say more technology comes in. And this is where procurement's role is very important, to anticipate what are the different buying paths that a particular user would need, and to be able to build that into the tool. So work with the technology team to build all these permutations, combinations in the backend, and so that when the user comes in, it's very intuitive and very user friendly for them. So I think setting up those is where procurement sort of stays in the background, but yet is the key element which is making it possible for the user, without the user knowing that all this is what procurement has done for them.
Now, I just want to pause for a second just to say, if anyone has any questions, again, please feel free to shoot them over. There's actually a question section and a chat section within GoToWebinar. If you send them in the question section, I'll be looking out for them, but if you send them in chat, Kelly will be able to pick up the questions as well. I want to talk a little bit about the impact of digital transformation on our performance objectives. Have you seen us be able to do I don't know, it doesn't seem like it's the right word, but a better job of actually tracking the metrics that are most important to the organization through using technology, whereas perhaps before we may only have looked at savings because it's the only thing that we can track. Are there more metrics that we can start tracking related to our performance that technology enables?
Yeah, so a very valid point. And even on savings, if you see, so far most organizations are able to track savings only very reactively, or probably with 3 to 6 months, or even probably at the end of the financial year, that they are able to actually know whether savings have come in or not. And we have heard of this proverbial fight with the finance team, which says, well, you said so much savings will come, but I don't see them on the bottom line.
I don't trust your numbers, or I don't believe them.
Yeah, not only believe them, but at the end of the year, they say, well, you said we don't see any of those savings that you projected in the beginning of the year. So now, however, with technology and with the advanced tools that are available, you can do almost real-time tracking to the last business day of savings, because you can map in terms of what purchase orders have been released, what invoices have come in, and versus the savings that were projected. So metrics like savings can now be tracked in near real time, and you can know what is the maverick spend, how much of the spend is not going through the preferred suppliers for that particular item, and take corrective action by reaching out to those stakeholders who are responsible for that. So I think, and this is where what the digital transformation of procurement, will be enabled, is to have these insights so that they can engage with the business stakeholders with the right, data and input, saying that, well, this is where we are losing money, or this is where we can save more money for the organization, and so on. So that's one. The other things which can now be tracked again on real time, and specific focus areas can be identified, is metrics like vendor reduction. In some organizations, they would like to reduce vendors. However, in a lot of organizations, they don't even know what is the exact number of vendors that they have, right? So, because you keep adding vendors, and there is a lot of dormant vendors, there's vendors duplicates and things like that, and so on. And so that, and more, in a lot of organizations, there is no one single vendor master actually. So you can't even add up as to what is the total number of vendors you have, and leave alone then, of course, measuring what is getting reduced. But now with the technology options that are available, all this can be done, again, as I said, in near real time, and on a dynamic basis, and you can be on top of it. You can control, you can devise strategies of how to not add vendors who are not who are like one time and things like that. So I think one of the key, I would say, drivers of digital transformation would be the ability to monitor the metrics and KPIs on a near real-time basis for the procurement team.
Yeah, and give access to that to the business. Not try and keep that within the four walls of procurement. I have one question that came in, but Kelly, I think you have one as well. So I'll defer to you first of all.
I do. Thanks for letting me break in. So, Kris, you were just talking about vendor rationalization or vendor count reduction as a potential metric associated with digital transformation. And Mike had a question that kind of balances the need to talk about fundamentals with some of these emerging technologies. And he's saying, to what extent do we have to have our current data and our current information really clean and really solid in order to be able to benefit from some of the technologies that build on top of that, right? We can't do advanced analytics if we don't have really good, clean data. and the example that you gave about vendor count. To what extent does someone need to examine what their current data maturity or data status is before trying to implement something new on top of it?
I would say that we could start with, I don't think 100% would be the right metric, while that's an ideal state. Probably in terms of if we were to look at it, 95% of the spend is something that if you have clean, cleansed, classified data for 95% of the spend, I think that's a good place to begin with. Typically, the vendor part of it is basically what we have seen is that the last 20% of data or 20% of spend is what contributes to about 60-70% of the vendor base, which is basically the low value one-time kind of vendors, right? So in terms of for different objectives of the organization, you would want to do different things or to different parts of the spend. So if it is vendor reduction, I think probably the last 20-25% from an ABC analysis of the spend, that's what you would focus on first, because your main spend vendors would typically already be fairly rationalized, and you would not you can address that part of the problem fairly quickly and in a much more simple way. The lower end of it is where there is a huge proliferation of vendors, and that's where it takes a lot more time and energy to and focus to be able to rationalize that. So it depends on while of course if you would like to do the better savings management, better supplier relationships management, then you would be looking at say the top 20% of your vendor base, or 40-50% of your spend, which is your main spend, and that's where then you would apply some levers to either get better savings or better supplier relationship management and things like that. So I think depending upon what is the focus area, which metric you are targeting, that part of the spend or the vendor data is where you would focus and have that either more clean or more analysis done and more focus and effort put into that.
Excellent. And as a matter of fact, while I have the floor, another question has just come in. Actually, a comment and a question from Khalid. He says, the best digital environments leverage in-use data against procurement, which has traditionally relied on historic data for any digitization. So his question is, how do you see usage of in-use data in procurement in the future?
Maybe so you said, how do we use in-use data? Is that what was the question?
Correct. How do you see procurement using in-use data in the future?
Okay. So, and I'm just trying to understand trying to understand the question.
Yeah,
I think.
And maybe if I can jump in, Khalid, if you could just clarify a little bit about in-use data, then I can.
Real-time data, or
what's that?
Is it real-time data? Is probably how I understand it.
Yeah, let's give it 1 second. I have actually some other questions, and Kelly will come back to that one then. Live data versus historical is what Carlos suggested. Perhaps that's the interpretation. So thinking about live data versus, historical data.
Yeah, so I think, again, it is contextual. There would be areas. So I think for a large part of probably the low to medium spend areas, and in a lot of the areas where unless procurement is doing some spot buying of commodities and things like that, or where there is some disruption which is expected because of some geopolitical or environmental reasons, I think that is where live data would be more relevant to procurement. Otherwise, we all know that procurement is not a space like something like a stock market where you need to take a spot decision based on a ticker which is running. So, it is much more measured and, analyzed decision that a procurement manager takes after getting in all the inputs and so on. And in most cases, you will not have a sort of real-time impact to the organization, barring exceptions, where you have to take a decision then and there based on some market input that is coming in. So those decisions are mostly, we don't see many of that in most of the procurement situations. So I wouldn't say it has a huge impact on procurement when we talk of live data, which could be about commodities or other developments that are happening in the procurement space. But yes, it is procurement should have up-to-date data for decisions and so on, which so that then they are able to react to those situations and go to stakeholders, suppliers, internal stakeholders, and so on.
Mm. And I just want to jump in and add something there. Kelly and I had the pleasure of writing a book on a relatively small book, but on supply chain transportation visibility. So I think a lot of that real-time data is more relevant in the supply chain space because it's when you're working, just in time than it is in the procurement space. There's a comment from Phil who talks about manufacturing companies, just talking about metrics, how a lot of manufacturing companies are tracking environmental impact metrics, such as reducing carbon footprint, reducing number of deliveries, reducing on-site traffic, which is lowering risk from health and safety perspective. So a lot of technology is enabling a lot of these metrics that are important to other areas of the business that perhaps we of procurement may not have seen before. I have a question. Let's see. It's a relatively long one, but I think I looked it over and it's an important point. It's from Jaya Thurtha again, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering the name, but the question is that I'm a student. I don't have practical experience in procurement, but I see a remarkable difference in opinion when it comes to the potential of automation in procurement. So, looking at research and white papers saying 60-70% of the procurement process can be automated, but then in speaking to procurement practitioners, there's a belief that the potential of automation is being over-exaggerated and that at its core, it's a human process. I think this is a really interesting question. Like, why is there such contrasting opinions when it comes to the use of automation in procurement?
I think one is, of course, there is always a lag between when, some technologies are available to adoption in the industry. So that is always there and has been there forever since technology came, So the promise of technology versus the reality, there is always a lag. However, I would say that the potential to automate, I think 60-70% of the procurement activities. So if we see source to pay as a process, yes, today we already have the technology. A lot of organizations are using those technologies to do their process in an automated way, right, or in an electronic way at least. Yeah. I think some of the areas where there are gaps in technology today is where the manual work still continues, or because organizations have not implemented or driven the adoption of some part of it. So I find a lot of organizations earlier were, for example, only implementing certain modules. So they would implement only source to contract or only P2P, or not have the e-sourcing module or not have the spend analytics module and things like that, right? So there would be gaps in their the source to pay process flow itself. And however, that is now coming down because more and more organizations which are moving to or newly moving to these technologies, they are more and more organizations are implementing the entire end-to-end source to pay. That's the trend that we see. So with that, we will see that the potential of having more and more of the activities actually getting automated will become more and more. So I think it's more I won't say that it is a letdown from the technology promise. I think the technology still has the capability to do what it said it will do.
Yeah.
It's more an adoption and filling the gaps in what the organizations currently have. So I think that's where the issue is.
Yeah, and if I can add that, I think that, again, the promise of the technology is there to automate the vast majority of what procurement does today, but that still doesn't take away from the fact that procurement is a human process. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. What it actually does, and for us, that's the art of procurement, is how can we then leverage the outputs of the technology to create opportunities that we can then use the relational side of what we do to have a bigger impact on the business. That's what's exciting to me about technology, is that it's not replacing procurement as a capability. It's actually going to enable us to have far more impact by using those interpersonal and relational skills.
Yeah, and there was a question around that as well. So, for example, supplier relationship, right? So, supplier relationship will always continue to be a human interface and a human touch activity. And however, what technology can do is to bring in all the elements, the information, the 360-degree view in terms of what the supplier's performance, spend, both internal and external inputs regarding the supplier's financial health or any other issues, so that the procurement manager has all the inputs available to, and as well as what is happening from a disruption in that particular supply market as well. So all that information and inputs, which now technology is making available to the procurement manager, will enable a more holistic discussion and giving direction to the relationship and bringing more balance to the relationship. So it empowers both the supplier and as well as the procurement manager to have a much more intelligent discussion regarding the relationship. But the human element is not going away, right? So yeah. It's the technology is only enriching it further from where it is today. And similarly in the other aspects, whether it's negotiation and contract management and so on, the decision making is where procurement managers would be required to focus more on, rather than in collecting the data for the decision making, which is what they end up doing today.
Kelly, I think you might have a question.
I do, as a matter of fact, and this is actually a question that I believe is a follow-up to the conversation we were having a minute ago about the difference between live or real-time data for use in procurement versus something that, even if it's very current, is a little bit more historical. Carlos asks, have you seen successful implementations of predictive models for tail spend where live data could potentially be of value?
Not, I wouldn't say in a big mainstream way. There are some examples where, for example, in some of the pilots that I know of, where you could predict when a machine could break down, and to do predictive procurement in advance and see that those parts and services are available in a predictive way rather than in a reactive way. So, but it is still, I would say, those are far and few in between. Not so much from looking at the patterns of usage or breakdowns or requirements, that a lot of predictive procurement is happening, but that's the way forward. So we will see more of it happening.
I have, there are some other questions, but what we're going to do, we've only got 5 more minutes left. After the session today, we'll actually be compiling the questions that we've received and doing some more thorough answers for everybody, putting that into a downloadable. So if you've asked questions so far, you haven't had the opportunity to get the answer for them, then we'll be taking those offline and we'll be following up directly, putting them in the downloadable. Because I just had a couple of last questions and I wanted to talk about talent, the impact on talent. And a couple of questions that I got in advance. First of all, I want to ask, and this is from Larry. Larry asks, how can more traditional procurement organizations leverage emerging talent? And I think the context there is when we think about multi-generational talent. We have a lot of digital natives coming into the workforce, obviously. A lot of us who aren't as, we didn't grow up with the technology, so you're learning the technology. How can an organization kind of leverage both of those dynamics?
Yeah, so I think it's a very interesting mix of talent that is available to an organization today. And as I said earlier, one is it's a challenge as well to bring it together and to have the right mix as well as to harness the talent in the right manner. So, for example, the digital natives bring in a good familiarity in terms of how the new age experience, how the Amazon experience should be, and how to design something like that. While the what would be the multiple permutation combinations for a user's procurement journey could possibly come from the more experienced folks and so on, right? So the digital natives could say, well, this is how we could make it, from a design thinking perspective, how it should be very user friendly and how we can do it. While the experienced folks bring in the what is the procurement control and process which needs to be embedded into while the experience is still user friendly.
Yeah.
So I think the other thing is to bring in talent which is or to harness talent which is asking the right questions. So typically procurement is not able to formulate the right questions for the stakeholders, right? So for example, are we as procurement managers, are we able to go to the marketing manager and say that you are not using the spend very effectively, right? Yeah. Or are we able to go to the IT stakeholder and say that we have bought 100 licenses of a particular software at a very good rate, but you actually needed only 20 of them. So the rest 80 is not being used in the first place. So that kind of, so what are the questions which procurement managers should be able to articulate? I think if we are able to leverage the multi-generational talent to connect with these stakeholders and make the experience for these stakeholders much more user-friendly, I think that would be the success for the procurement team.
Okay. Well, we have, and I think it's all about diversity, isn't it? Diversity of the team, and not necessarily think you have to go one way or the other, but how do you marry those experiences together? We're on our last minute, so it has to be a quick fire answer. I had a question from Larissa. Larissa was really asking about changing skill sets in procurement as we become more digital native, as we have access to this technology. So I'll kind of paraphrase that into maybe a 1-word or a 2-word answer. Do you think that is procurement technical skills becoming less relevant today as we become more, as the focus becomes more on the relational element of procurement and asking the right questions?
I would say knowing the process is becoming less relevant because it's getting automated. Yeah. Knowing what the stakeholder wants and how to meet what the stakeholders want. Yeah. I think that is more important.
Okay. No, I could ask multiple follow-ups on that, but I know we're out of time. So I want to just thank you, Kris, first of all, for joining us on AOP Live and for being gamely up for a grilling from our audience. I want to thank everybody who joined us today for submitting all the questions. And thank you, Kris, once more. Thanks, Kelly, for covering the questions as well. Hi there. I want to thank you for tuning in to today's podcast. You can check out all of our back catalogue at artofprocurement.com/podcast, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter to make sure that you never miss an episode. And if you found value in today's show, I'd love if you would tell a peer, or perhaps go and rate and review by going to artofprocurement.com/review. Word of mouth really is the best way to help the podcast grow, and if you're able to do either one of those things, I would truly appreciate it.